The icy winds of a New York winter howled through the empty streets as a thick blanket of snow descended upon the city. At 48, Elias Morgan, a billionaire tech mogul with everything anyone could want, found himself walking alone, far from the boardrooms and meetings that defined his life. The chill in the air matched the emptiness he felt inside. His vast empire could not fill the void left by the sudden loss of his wife, Emily. Elias had built his empire on long hours and unrelenting ambition. The world saw a powerful, successful CEO, but all he saw when he looked in the mirror was a man haunted by grief and a personal life reduced to a distant memory. For 2 years, he'd kept his focus solely on work, a means of escape from the life he once shared with Emily, the woman who had been his everything. Now, in the solitude of his Upper East Side mansion, his wealth felt hollow, a mere byproduct of a life he no longer understood. That night, as the storm raged outside, Elias did something he hadn't done in years. He left the comfort of his office and took a walk through Central Park, his mind a blur of thoughts and memories. The city, usually vibrant, was deserted under the weight of the snowstorm, and as he walked deeper into the park, the stillness of the night pressed in on him. His thoughts wandered to Emily, her voice still clear in his memory, urging him to live beyond work. "Promise me, Elias, that you won't let work steal your life." But it had, hadn't it? Then a sound, a child's sob, barely audible over the wind. Elias stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. He strained to listen, his instincts sharpening. The faint sound, so out of place in the freezing, desolate park, pulled him forward like a magnet. He followed the sound, his breath visible in the frigid air, until he reached a small cluster of trees near the playground. There, beneath the shade of an old bench, were 2 children, lost, alone, and shivering in the snow. His heart clenched as he took in their fragile forms, their small faces pale with cold and fear. "Are you okay?" Elias asked, kneeling beside them, his voice soft but urgent as he offered his coat. The girl, with bright red hair and fearful eyes, looked up at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and desperation. "We got lost," she whispered. And in that moment, Elias saw something more than just 2 children in the storm. He saw the chance for redemption, the chance to heal a part of himself he thought was beyond saving. This was no accident. Something in the storm, in these children, had found him. The girl's name was Amelia, and her brother Luke clung to her side, his tiny body trembling from the cold. They were all alone, their parents nowhere to be found. For a moment, Elias felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness, a feeling that he hadn't experienced since Emily's death. He carefully lifted Luke into his arms, the boy's small body feeling like ice against his chest. As he guided the children through the blinding snow, Elias couldn't help but wonder how these 2 had ended up here, stranded in a storm with no one to care for them. Who were they? What were their lives like before the storm? But those questions could wait. The more pressing matter was getting them out of the cold, to safety, to warmth. And so, the journey to his mansion began. Elias held Luke gently in his arms, feeling the small boy's body trembling against him, while Amelia walked beside him, clutching his coat tightly. They trudged through the snow-covered path, the wind howling around them like a chorus of angry spirits, but Elias was determined. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering structure barely visible through the thick snow. Every step felt like an eternity, but Elias pushed forward, his focus solely on the children's well-being. When they finally crossed the threshold into the warmth of his home, Elias felt the weight of the cold melt away. The mansion, which had always felt like a fortress of isolation, suddenly felt like a place of refuge. As the door closed behind them, the heat from the grand fireplace in the foyer enveloped them, a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. Elias felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The children were still huddled together, their eyes wide as they took in their surroundings. It was impossible not to notice their awe at the sight of the opulence around them. The massive marble pillars, the gold-trimmed chandeliers, the plush velvet furniture. They were in a world completely different from the one they had known. Come in, Elias urged, stepping aside to let them into the warmth. "You're safe now." Luke and Amelia hesitated at first, but Elias gently guided them further into the house. Clara, Elias called out, his voice echoing in the massive hallway. Within moments, Clara, his housekeeper of over 10 years, appeared from the kitchen. Her gray hair was neatly tied in a bun, and her eyes immediately softened when she saw the two children standing in front of her, visibly shivering. "Mr. Morgan, are these the children?" Clara asked with a motherly concern in her voice. Elias nodded. "Yes, Clara. They've been out in the storm. Please, get them settled. Warm blankets, hot cocoa, whatever you can." Clara didn't waste a second. "Of course, Mr. Morgan." She motioned for the children to follow her. "Come on, dear ones. Let's get you warm. I'll make you something to drink." Amelia and Luke followed Clara, but not without one last glance at Elias, their faces still cautious. Elias watched them for a moment, a sense of unfamiliarity tugging at his chest. He knew they had been through something far more than just a lost evening in the park. Their expressions, guarded, wary, spoke volumes about the hardships they had endured. As Clara ushered them into the kitchen, Elias felt his pulse quicken. He needed to know more about them. How had they ended up in this storm? Who were they? Why were they all alone? The warmth of the kitchen was a welcome relief for the children. Clara quickly set about her work, pouring milk into a pot and heating it, while Amelia and Luke sat at the large oak kitchen table, still bundled in Elias's coat. Elias leaned against the marble counter, watching them carefully. The sound of the wind outside seemed to grow muffled in the comforting warmth of the mansion, but there was a heaviness in the air as Elias waited for them to speak. Finally, it was Amelia who broke the silence. She was still clutching his coat tightly, her small hands trembling. "We don't know where our parents are," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, like she was unsure if she was allowed to speak of them. Elias's heart tightened. "What happened?" he asked gently, not wanting to push them too hard but needing answers. Amelia paused, her green eyes flickering to Luke, who was sitting beside her with his head down. "Our parents, they died in a car accident," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke the words, as though they were still too painful for her to fully understand. Elias leaned forward, his heart aching. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice low. "What happened after that?" "We were sent to a shelter," Amelia continued, her gaze not meeting his. "It wasn't much, but it was a place to sleep. There were other kids there too, but it wasn't safe." She stopped for a moment, her face tightening as if the memories were too fresh. "Our aunt promised she would take us in, but she never came. She disappeared." Elias's mind reeled at the implications of her words. An aunt who had abandoned them? The thought seemed almost unthinkable, yet here they were, two innocent children caught in a storm, with no one else to rely on. "They sent us out in the storm," Amelia continued, her voice small now, but with an underlying bitterness. "They said they couldn't keep us anymore. They said it was too cold and there were no more beds." Elias clenched his jaw, anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. How could anyone, how could any institution, turn these children away in the middle of a storm? The weight of their lives, their past, pressed heavily on him. Clara returned with 2 steaming mugs of cocoa, her expression soft. "Drink up, dears. It'll help you feel better." Amelia hesitated for a moment before taking the mug, her hands still shaking as she wrapped them around the warm cup. Luke followed suit, though he remained silent, his large brown eyes glancing up at Elias occasionally. Elias watched them both carefully, his mind still reeling with their story. Aunt gone. No place to stay, nowhere to turn. The thought gnawed at him. "You're safe now," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he hadn't expected. His voice broke for just a moment, and he quickly cleared his throat. "I'm going to make sure nothing bad happens to you again. You can stay here as long as you need." Amelia looked up at him, her face guarded but softening as she took a sip of her cocoa. Luke remained silent beside her, still clutching his mug. Elias could see the hesitation in their eyes, the lingering doubt that what he was saying could really be true. He couldn't blame them. They had been through so much, and he was just another stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Clara left them alone after a few moments, heading to another part of the mansion, leaving Elias alone with the children. He wasn't sure what to do now, how to bridge the gap between this moment and the future. He moved to sit down across from them, his gaze shifting from one child to the other. Amelia, with her red hair and weary green eyes, reminded him of the fierce protectiveness Emily had always shown. Luke, his small form slouched in his seat, was the picture of exhaustion, and Elias could see the pain in his eyes. "I know this is all a lot to take in," Elias said, his voice softer now. "But you can trust me. You're not alone anymore." Amelia hesitated, glancing at Luke before responding. "I don't know if we can trust anyone anymore," she said quietly. "We've been let down so many times." Elias felt a pang in his chest. "I understand," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe here." Amelia studied him for a moment before speaking again, her voice tinged with something like hope. "Do you really mean that?" Elias nodded. "Yes, I do. I've made some mistakes in my life, but I'm not going to make one now. You're safe with me." As Elias sat there, listening to the children's quiet conversation and the sound of the storm outside, his thoughts began to drift. He thought of Emily, the love they had shared, the plans they had made. Her words echoed in his mind. "Promise me, Elias, that you won't let work steal your life." How many times had he ignored those words? How many years had he buried his grief, thinking that success and wealth could fill the emptiness? Now, with 2 children in his care, Elias was forced to confront a part of himself he'd long avoided. His life had been about power, control, and the next business deal. But in this moment, he realized how far he had strayed from the man he used to be. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to make a real difference. The children, Amelia and Luke, needed him, and Elias couldn't afford to fail them. But how could he do this? He had no experience raising children. His life was far from normal, and they deserved a home, not just a temporary refuge. Could he give them that? Could he be the father they needed, or would he fail them, just like his business had failed him after Emily's death? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. He couldn't turn back now. Elias looked at the children, 2 innocent lives that had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. He had the power to change their lives. And just maybe, they could change his as well. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out everything else. You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt the weight of a new responsibility settle over him. Not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had the chance to rebuild something far more important. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment. Elias had always been a man of control, of planning. But with Amelia and Luke in his care, everything had changed. His life, once a calculated series of meetings and deadlines, had suddenly become a blur of schoolwork, bedtime routines, and making sure the children felt safe in a house that was, for them, as alien as it was warm. Each day, Elias found himself growing more attached to the children. Amelia, who had once been so guarded and cautious, had begun to open up in small ways. She told him stories about the shelter she'd grown up in, stories of how she had learned to care for Luke and keep him safe. Even in her young age, she had a maturity that belied her years, and Elias often found himself marveling at her strength. Luke, on the other hand, was quieter. He clung to Amelia most of the time, but Elias could see the trust slowly growing in his eyes. The boy's shy smiles and the rare moments when he would speak to Elias about his love for space exploration began to thaw the fortress Elias had built around his heart. It was in these small moments, during shared meals or quiet afternoons spent watching cartoons in the living room, that Elias realized how much he had missed the simple joys of life. It wasn't just the children who were changing. Elias himself felt something stirring deep within him, a longing to become the father figure he never thought he could be. He spent evenings reading stories to them, often taking over their nightly routine. They would sit together in the library, and Elias would make up tales about faraway lands and brave adventurers. It was in those moments that he realized how much he had missed out on, how much of himself he had neglected for the sake of ambition. But it wasn't easy. Every morning, after the kids were off to school or settled in with Clara, his housekeeper, Elias would retreat to his office to handle his business affairs. The weight of his tech empire was ever present, and he often found it difficult to juggle the demands of his company with the growing responsibilities at home. The moments of joy with Amelia and Luke, the laughter and warmth that filled his mansion, felt like a stark contrast to the high-pressure world of Morgan Tech. The pull of work was always there. Elias had built Morgan Tech from the ground up, and it had become his entire life. Now, with 2 children relying on him, he was forced to divide his attention in ways he wasn't accustomed to. He would spend hours on conference calls negotiating deals, managing the growing media presence around his company, and still find time to check in on the children. He often found himself late to dinner, rushing through a meal just to make sure Amelia and Luke were settled before he dove back into his work. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Elias sat at his desk rubbing his temples. The weight of everything, his business, the children, the pressure to be both a CEO and a father, was starting to take its toll. He had no experience with children, no manual on how to raise them, and no guide to teach him how to navigate the emotional landscape of fatherhood. He often wondered if he was doing it right. Was he giving them enough of his time? Was he doing enough to make them feel at home? He had no answers, only an overwhelming sense of responsibility that gnawed at him every time he looked at their hopeful faces. He picked up his phone and checked his emails, trying to distract himself from the rising anxiety in his chest. But the screen quickly brought him back to reality. Morgan Tech was facing an emerging crisis. Rival firms had begun circulating rumors, accusing his company of corporate espionage. The media, once obsessed with the story of the billionaire who had taken in 2 lost children, was now all over the allegations. The whispers in the industry had turned into a full-blown scandal. The accusations came at a time when Elias thought he had finally found some balance in his life. He had built Morgan Tech into one of the most successful companies in the tech world. But now, the foundation seemed to be crumbling. The media quickly latched onto the story, and soon, Elias found himself bombarded with calls from journalists, potential investors, and even his own employees, all asking the same question: what's going on with Morgan Tech? For the first time in years, Elias felt the walls closing in. He couldn't hide from the crisis. It was real, and it was happening in the public eye. He had been so focused on the children that he hadn't fully realized how precarious his position was in the business world. Now, with a growing scandal at his back and the welfare of 2 vulnerable children in his care, Elias was under more pressure than ever. The first media interview he did was a disaster. The questions were relentless, the scrutiny unforgiving. They wanted to know about the rival company's claims, about his company's internal operations, and about his sudden involvement in the lives of these children. Elias did his best to stay composed, but it was clear he was struggling to keep the 2 worlds, his family and his business, separate. The story of the lost children, the one that had once been so heartwarming, was now being overshadowed by the whispers of scandal. Elias spent days in meetings with his lawyers and public relations team, working to clear his name and restore Morgan Tech's reputation. Meanwhile, at home, he tried his best to keep up the illusion of normalcy. He didn't want Amelia and Luke to sense the tension in the house, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The uncertainty surrounding the company seemed to seep into everything. From his distracted conversations with Clara to the late nights he spent hunched over his desk. The children began to notice. It started with little things. Amelia, ever watchful, began to ask questions. Quietly, when Elias thought she wasn't listening. She would sit at the kitchen table, eyes narrowed, as she observed him working late into the night. "Are you okay, Mr. Morgan?" she would ask, her voice soft but filled with concern. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the stress in the way he ran his hands through his hair. Luke, more sensitive than he appeared, would cling to his sister when the house seemed too quiet, sensing the unease in the air. One night, after a particularly tense phone call with his lawyer, Elias found himself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the city skyline. The storm had subsided, but the weight of the situation was still heavy on his shoulders. He heard the soft padding of feet behind him, and when he turned around, he saw Amelia standing in the doorway, her green eyes filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Are we going to leave?" she asked, her voice small, barely above a whisper. Elias's heart dropped. It was a question he hadn't wanted to answer, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he knew how much the children were depending on him. What if this doesn't work out? What if they have to go back to the shelter? He had promised them safety, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing in his life. "No, Amelia," he said, his voice firm but soft, as he walked toward her. "You're not going anywhere, not while I'm here. I promise you. You're safe with me." Amelia stared up at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Finally, she nodded, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. She was a smart girl, too smart for her age, and Elias could see the cracks in her facade. They had both been through too much for him to think they could just settle into a perfect life with him overnight. But Elias couldn't allow himself to doubt. Not now, not when the children needed him the most. "Get some rest," he added gently, his voice softer. "We'll take care of everything, okay?" Amelia didn't respond verbally, but she walked over and gave him a brief, almost hesitant hug before retreating to her room. Elias stood there for a moment, the weight of her fear pressing down on him. The storm had passed outside, but inside, the tension was just beginning to rise. As Elias watched Amelia and Luke settle into bed that night, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows across the room, he knew the battle ahead wouldn't just be one of business deals and media crises. It was about trust. It was about creating a life for these children, even when his own world seemed to be falling apart. The storm outside had brought them together, but it would be his responsibility to ensure they didn't get swept away by the currents of a life he was only beginning to understand. The pressure was mounting, but Elias wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when he had something worth fighting for. The storm outside had long since passed, but the one that had taken over Elias's life was just beginning. The media frenzy surrounding Morgan Tech's scandal had escalated to new heights. Reports had started to question not only his business practices, but his personal life, dragging his newfound responsibilities into the spotlight. Elias had always prided himself on his ability to control his public image, to keep his private life separate from the world of corporate warfare. But now, the walls were closing in. The headlines were relentless. Billionaire CEO under investigation for corporate espionage. Does he have time to raise children? Family man or publicity stunt? Elias Morgan's personal life under scrutiny amid scandal. The paparazzi gathered outside his mansion, and the phone calls from journalists flooded in at all hours of the day. He couldn't escape the questions, the judgment. His private life, once so carefully guarded, was now a public spectacle. They asked if he was fit to be a father, whether he could truly provide for Amelia and Luke while dealing with the accusations against his company. Elias had spent decades building his tech empire, weathering every storm that came his way. But this was different. For the first time, he wasn't just fighting for himself or his company. He was fighting for the children who had come to rely on him. And that realization hit him harder than any corporate challenge he had faced. He could handle the accusations. He had to. But the growing scrutiny of his ability to care for Amelia and Luke, to provide them with stability and love, was something he couldn't easily ignore. Every interview he gave seemed to twist his intentions. Every comment from a journalist turned into another question about his ability to juggle his professional life and his new family. They were all too quick to judge, but Elias couldn't avoid it anymore. His personal life was now part of the public narrative, and the fear of losing Amelia and Luke loomed over him like a dark cloud. The allegations against Morgan Tech had reached a boiling point. The rival tech firm had ramped up its campaign, filing lawsuits and pushing for a public inquiry into the company's dealings. The media was only too eager to pick up the story, feeding on the scandal, and the pressure was mounting. Elias's legal team was working tirelessly to clear his name, but every day brought new challenges. The rival firm's claims were baseless, but the damage to his reputation was real. As the media coverage intensified, Elias found himself sinking into a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, public relations experts, and his board of directors. Every conversation seemed to blur into the next, every decision more urgent than the last. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, the pressure threatening to crush him from all sides. Yet, through it all, he couldn't shake the nagging thought. What about the children? Amelia and Luke had become his world, and the thought of them being torn away from him was unbearable. The fear of losing them, of them being sent back to the shelter or worse, being taken from him by social services, was a constant weight on his chest. He had promised them safety, a future. How could he make good on that promise when his entire life seemed to be unraveling in the public eye? In the quiet moments between the chaos, Elias found himself staring out of his office window, watching the world go by. He could hear the laughter of the children in the background, their carefree voices drifting in from the other room, and it made him ache. The warmth of the home they had begun to build together felt like a distant dream, slipping further out of reach with each passing day. Was he really cut out for this? It wasn't just about his company anymore. Elias realized that the fight he was facing wasn't just corporate, it was personal. He couldn't let these accusations destroy the life he had started to build with Amelia and Luke. He had promised them safety, and he wasn't about to back down. He had always been a man of action, a man who took control of any situation. And now, Elias Morgan was determined to take control of his life, to fight for his family, even if that meant facing the media firestorm head-on. He would prove the rival company's accusations were lies. He would prove that he was more than just a billionaire with a troubled past. He was a man who was willing to fight for what mattered most. His resolve hardened as he stepped out of his office and into the grand hallway of his mansion. The house was quiet now, the children tucked away in their rooms, their faces calm and peaceful as they slept. Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude in that moment. These two children had come into his life when he least expected it, and now he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The media, the scandal, it was all a distraction. The true fight, Elias realized, was here at home, in the small moments spent with Amelia and Luke, in the way they had started to look to him for support and comfort. The world may have been against him, but he wouldn't let that stand in the way of protecting the family he had found in the midst of the storm. But despite his resolve, Elias couldn't silence the voice in the back of his mind, the voice that told him he was in over his head. He had never imagined himself as a father, never planned for it. The idea of being responsible for two children, especially after losing his wife, felt like a mountain too steep to climb. As the days wore on, Elias began to question himself more and more. Was he really fit to be their father? Could he give them the stability they needed? He had grown used to the loneliness that came with being a billionaire CEO, but now, with the children relying on him, he couldn't help but feel inadequate. What if they didn't want to stay? What if he couldn't provide them with the life they deserved? The fear of losing them crept into his thoughts at night when he was alone in his office, working late to clear his name. Amelia and Luke had begun to settle into their new lives, but Elias could see the unease in their eyes. They had started to sense the tension in the house, the quiet moments when Elias would retreat into himself, his mind preoccupied with the scandal. One evening, after a particularly long day of phone calls and meetings, Elias returned to the kitchen to find Amelia sitting at the table, staring into her cocoa with a faraway look in her eyes. She didn't seem surprised when he sat down beside her. "Are you okay, Mr. Morgan?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias smiled weakly, but his heart wasn't in it. "I'm okay, Amelia. Just a lot on my mind." "You don't seem okay," she said, her voice steady despite her young age. "You're always working, and you don't smile like you used to." Elias was taken aback by her insight. He hadn't realized how much his own tension had started to affect the children. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm just trying to fix everything. But I promise you, I'll figure it out. We'll be okay." Amelia's green eyes softened as she looked up at him. "We are okay," she said with surprising certainty. "You're our family now, and we're staying together, no matter what happens." Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much he needed to hear those words. We're staying together. The uncertainty, the fear of failure, it all seemed to dissipate for a moment. Amelia, with her maturity and wisdom beyond her years, had reminded him of something he had forgotten. They were already a family. In that quiet moment, Elias realized that no matter how hard things got, he would never let them go. His priorities had shifted, and no matter the cost, he would fight for this family, for their future, for their happiness. The next morning, After a restless night spent worrying about the future, Elias woke up to the sound of Amelia and Luke playing in the living room. Their laughter filled the house, and for the first time in a long time, Elias felt a sense of peace. He walked into the room, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Amelia looked up at him with a bright smile, and Luke, sitting on the floor with a toy car, waved his small hand at him. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," Amelia said, her voice filled with warmth. "Good morning," Elias replied, his smile genuine for the first time in a while. "How did you sleep?" "Great," Luke responded, his eyes shining. "We made a race with the cars and Amelia's the fastest." Amelia rolled her eyes playfully. "I'm not that fast." Elias chuckled, the sound light and carefree. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. He was a father now, and nothing, not the scandal, not the media, not the fear, nothing could change that. "I'm proud of you both," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've brought life back into this house, and I'll make sure you never lose it again." Amelia smiled, her green eyes sparkling. "We're a family, Mr. Morgan." Elias's heart swelled. "Yes, we are." And for the first time, Elias Morgan felt like he had everything he truly needed: love, hope, and the family he never thought he could have. The first few days after the media storm had been a blur of meetings, phone calls, and media inquiries. Elias had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was different. This time the stakes were higher. This time it wasn't just his company or reputation on the line. It was the lives of the children who had come to depend on him. The accusations of corporate espionage from the rival tech firm had escalated, turning into a full-blown crisis. The media was relentless, portraying him as a man who had failed in both his personal and professional life. But Elias was determined to prove them wrong. The legal team at Morgan Tech was working around the clock, combing through documents, gathering evidence, and preparing their defense. Elias sat in on every meeting, his eyes glued to the details, absorbing the minutiae of the case like he had with every other aspect of his business. He had always been in control, always the one making the calls. But this was different. The accusations felt personal, as if they were not just attacking his company but his very character. Yet, as the hours stretched into days, Elias found it harder to focus on the legal battle without thinking of the children. Every time he looked at them, he saw the trust in their eyes, the trust they had placed in him when they had no reason to. Amelia and Luke had already been through so much, and now they were depending on him to protect them, not just from the outside world, but from the uncertainty that seemed to hang over their lives like a shadow. He could feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him with every passing hour. He had to clear his name, but he also had to be present for Amelia and Luke. He couldn't afford to fail them. The pressure was mounting. Every article, every news broadcast seemed to chip away at his resolve. "Billionaire CEO under investigation for corporate fraud," the headlines screamed. "Allegations of financial misconduct at Morgan Tech." The media was relentless, and Elias could do little to control the narrative. All he could do was fight back with the only weapon he had: his determination. Late one night, as he sat in his office, his mind racing with strategies and counter-arguments, his phone buzzed with another email from his legal team. It was an update on the progress of their defense. The rival tech company had filed a lawsuit, accusing Morgan Tech of stealing intellectual property, but the evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. Elias knew that with enough scrutiny the truth would come out. But it was going to take time that he couldn't afford to waste. His gaze drifted to the photo on his desk, one of him and Emily, taken at their wedding. Her smiling face seemed to watch over him, reminding him of the promise he had made to her all those years ago. Don't let work steal your life. Elias had failed to keep that promise, and he was paying for it now. But this time, he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers. He wouldn't let it destroy the new family he had found. As the legal team continued to work on their defense, Elias turned his attention to the children. He didn't have the luxury of pretending everything was okay. Amelia and Luke were perceptive, too perceptive, and they could sense the tension in the house. They had already been through enough, and the last thing he wanted was for them to think they were going to be sent back to the shelter. One afternoon, After another exhausting day spent in meetings with his lawyers, Elias found himself in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as he stared out the window. The snow had stopped, but the city still felt heavy, weighed down by the uncertainty of everything that was happening. He felt the familiar presence of Amelia as she entered the room, her small steps barely making a sound on the marble floors. "Mr. Morgan?" Amelia's voice was tentative, almost uncertain. She had been quieter than usual, a far cry from the brave and protective girl he had come to know. "Amelia, you're okay?" Elias asked, his eyes flickering to her. The worry in her eyes stopped him in his tracks. She nodded, though there was no real conviction behind it. "I'm fine, just—" She trailed off, glancing over at the empty dining room where Luke was playing with his toys. Elias set his coffee down and walked over to her. "What's on your mind?" Amelia hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice small. "Are we going to be okay, with everything that's happening?" The question hit him harder than he expected. Are we going to be okay? He had been so focused on the legal battle, on clearing his name, that he hadn't fully realized how much the stress was affecting Amelia and Luke. They didn't understand the details of what was going on, but they could sense the unease. They were children, but they weren't naive. "We're going to be okay. I promise," Elias said, his voice steady. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure we stay together. I won't let anything happen to you." Amelia studied him for a moment, her eyes still uncertain. "But what if they take us away? What if we have to go back to the shelter?" Elias felt a pang of guilt shoot through him. The last thing he wanted was for Amelia and Luke to feel the fear of abandonment again. He had made them a promise when they first arrived, that he would keep them safe. But with the media circus surrounding his company, Elias feared that promise was in jeopardy. "We're not going anywhere," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I will fight for you, for both of you. I will never let you go." Amelia's eyes softened, and for the first time in days she offered him a small, tentative smile. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything to him. He couldn't afford to let them down, not now. Not after everything they had been through. Elias knew the battle wasn't just against the media or the rival firm. It was for the children he had come to love, for the family he was building from the wreckage of his life. In the midst of the chaos, Elias found support in places he hadn't expected. The neighborhood, once just a backdrop to his solitary existence, was now rallying behind him. It started with small gestures, neighbors offering to run errands, bringing food, and even sending cards of encouragement. Elias had always been a private man, but now he found himself accepting help, something he had never done before. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who lived next door, was one of the first to offer her support. She had always been a quiet presence in the neighborhood, but Elias found her standing on his doorstep one morning, a warm casserole dish in her hands. "I know you're going through a rough time, Elias," she said with a gentle smile, "but I wanted you to know we're here for you. We're all in this together." It was the first time in a long while that Elias had felt the true sense of community. He had been so consumed by work, by his ambition, that he had never taken the time to get to know the people around him. But now, in the midst of his struggles, he saw the neighborhood in a new light. They weren't just acquaintances. They were his support system. As the days passed, the tension in the house began to ease. Amelia and Luke settled into their new routine, their fears starting to subside as they saw Elias fighting for them. He continued to be present in their lives, attending parent-teacher meetings, helping them with their homework, and spending time with them in the evenings. Slowly, the bond between them grew stronger. Elias's resolve to protect them grew with each passing day. He spent countless hours working to clear his name, but at the same time he made sure that Amelia and Luke never felt like they were second place. They were his priority now, and nothing would change that. But despite his efforts, the emotional toll of the situation was beginning to take its toll on Elias. The pressure from both his personal and professional life was overwhelming. There were days when he felt like he couldn't breathe, when the weight of everything, his company, the media scrutiny, and the responsibility of raising two children was too much to bear. But in the quiet moments when he would sit with Amelia and Luke, he found the strength to keep going. Their laughter, their joy, it was all the motivation he needed to fight through the storm. The emotional toll wasn't just about the business. It was about the life Elias had built, the family he was trying to create, and the fear that he wasn't enough. Every day, he questioned himself. Am I doing enough for them? Am I really cut out for this? There were moments when doubt crept in, when he wondered if he was setting them up for disappointment. But then he would look at them, Amelia's bright eyes, Luke's innocent smile, and he knew that he had to keep fighting. One evening, after another grueling day spent in meetings with his legal team, Elias sat in the library with Amelia and Luke, reading a story aloud. The children were laughing, their heads resting on his shoulders, and for the first time in days, Elias felt a sense of peace. It was fleeting, but it was enough. It reminded him that no matter how hard things got, he wasn't alone. And neither were they. He would fight for them, for this family, and he wouldn't let anyone take that away from him. It came to Elias in the dead of night, the kind of email that would change everything. He had been sitting at his desk, eyes bleary from hours of work, when the message pinged into his inbox. At first, he almost ignored it. Another legal update, another plea for him to focus on clearing Morgan Tech's name. He was sick of hearing the same thing, the same story, the same accusations. The rivalry with the other tech firm had eaten up his every waking hour, and the media had been relentless. But there was something about this email that caught his attention. No subject line, no name in the from field, just an anonymous tip. Curiosity piqued, Elias opened the message. The content was brief, almost cryptic, but it hit him like a freight train. The truth is buried beneath lies. I worked for Morgan Tech. I'm the one who planted the evidence against you. Here are the files. Attached were several documents, one of which was a detailed confession. It was from Marcus Chen, a former employee of Morgan Tech who had worked in the international division. Elias's hands shook as he scrolled through the document, reading the words that confirmed everything. Marcus had orchestrated the fake evidence that accused Elias's company of corporate espionage. The man had confessed in full detail that he had planted false documents in an attempt to frame Elias for a crime he didn't commit. The motive? Simple greed. Marcus had been trying to cover his tracks after stealing sensitive company information for a rival firm. When that firm threatened to expose him, he had created the false narrative to deflect attention away from his own wrongdoing. The scandal he had created had almost destroyed Elias, but now, with the truth in his hands, Elias could feel the pressure lifting, ever so slightly. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The pieces were finally falling into place. All the sleepless nights, the endless media coverage, the fear of losing Amelia and Luke, it had all been a manipulation. The storm that had surrounded his life was built on lies. He wasn't the villain. He was the victim. But as the weight of the truth sank in, another thought gripped him. The children. Amelia and Luke had been exposed to so much turmoil, so much uncertainty. Would this revelation come too late? Would they see him as just another man who had failed them? But for now, Elias focused on the task at hand. He had to clear his name. The first step was to take this new information to his legal team. He needed to prove that the accusations were false, that his company had done nothing wrong. He wasn't going to let this scandal define him or his future. Not anymore. By the next morning, Elias had already started working with his legal team to validate the evidence from Marcus's confession. The truth was there, black and white, and Elias knew it would take time to untangle the mess that had been made. But he had a weapon now. Proof. Proof that would bring him back from the brink, back into the light. As he sat in his office watching the news unfold, he couldn't help but notice the shift in the media's tone. For weeks, they had painted him as the villain. The headlines had been cruel, accusing him of everything from embezzlement to fraud, painting him as a heartless billionaire who cared for nothing but his company. But now, those same media outlets began to change their tune. The truth was out, and the world had a new story to tell. Billionaire CEO Elias Morgan clears his name in corporate scandal, one headline read. Rival firms' fabricated evidence exposed. Elias Morgan's innocence proven, another followed. The media storm that had once felt suffocating was now turning into a wave of support. Reporters began reaching out to him, asking for interviews about his innocence and the emotional journey he had been on with Amelia and Luke. The narrative that had been crafted around his downfall was slowly shifting into a story of redemption. Elias wasn't just the CEO of a tech empire anymore. He was a man who had been brought to the brink by lies and deceit, only to rise again with the truth. As the days went on, the media coverage of his company's scandal became more sympathetic. Stories of his care for Amelia and Luke, the bond they had formed, began to dominate the headlines. The public's perception of him had been transformed from a greedy businessman to a man who had proven his integrity and his devotion to his new family. With the scandal behind him and his name cleared, Elias could finally breathe again. The weight that had hung over him for so long was starting to lift, but he knew that there was still one more battle to fight: the adoption of Amelia and Luke. He had promised them a future, a stable home, and now it was time to make that promise official. The media had already embraced the idea of Elias as a father figure, but the legal process was far more complicated. The adoption process for two children, especially ones as vulnerable as Amelia and Luke, was never going to be easy. There would be background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations. The road ahead was long, but Elias was determined to see it through. He sat in his office one morning, paperwork spread out before him. The documents were filled with terms he hadn't ever had to deal with before. Terms like custody, legal guardianship, parental rights. He wasn't sure what the process would entail, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop until Amelia and Luke were legally his. He had already fought too hard for them, and he wasn't about to back down now. It wasn't just about the legalities. It was about making sure they were safe, making sure they knew they had a place in this world, and most importantly, making sure they knew that they were loved. Elias wasn't just fighting for custody, he was fighting for their future. And now, with the truth about the corporate scandal finally out, he could focus all his energy on this. Amelia and Luke had already begun to settle into their new lives with him. They were laughing more, talking more, their fears slowly beginning to fade as they saw him fighting for them, as they saw the man he was becoming. But Elias couldn't help but wonder if they truly understood the implications of everything that had happened. Did they realize that their lives, their future, were now in his hands? One evening, after dinner, Elias found Amelia and Luke sitting on the couch, talking softly to each other. The house had quieted down for the night, and the familiar warmth of their presence filled the space. Elias walked over and sat down next to them. "How are you both doing?" he asked, his voice soft. Amelia smiled up at him, her green eyes bright. "We're okay. It's nice here, Mr. Morgan. It's like a real home." Elias felt a lump form in his throat at her words. A real home. That was what he had always wanted to give them, a sense of belonging. A place where they didn't have to worry, where they could feel safe. "You're going to be here for a long time," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to make sure of it. You're my family now, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you stay that way." Luke, who had been sitting silently by Amelia's side, looked up at him. "Will we be here forever?" Elias's heart swelled with emotion. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them go. Forever, buddy, forever. As the days turned into weeks, Elias's resolve grew stronger. The media storm had passed, and the legal battle for his company's reputation was slowly winding down. Now, his focus was on building the future for Amelia and Luke. They weren't just children in his house anymore, they were his children. And he was going to make sure that no matter what, they knew they were loved and protected. The adoption process would take time, but Elias was willing to wait. He was ready for the challenges ahead, ready to face whatever came his way. With Amelia and Luke by his side, he finally understood what it meant to be truly alive, truly connected. They had brought him back from the brink, and now it was time for him to give them the life they deserved. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Elias was no longer afraid. With the truth on his side and a family to fight for, he was ready to take on whatever came next. The reality of the adoption process hit Elias like a storm. While the legal fight to clear his name had settled, another challenge loomed over him: the intense scrutiny that came with adopting two children. It wasn't as simple as signing a few papers. It was a rigorous, multifaceted process that delved into every corner of his life. Elias had always been someone who prided himself on being in control, but this process was unlike anything he had experienced before. It was one thing to lead a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, but quite another to prove he was fit to be a father. The first part of the adoption process involved the dreaded home study. A social worker, Mrs. Daniels, was assigned to assess his home, his lifestyle, and most importantly, his ability to care for Amelia and Luke. It was a grueling process, and Elias could already feel the weight of it. The house was immaculate, of course, but there were so many more factors to consider than just a spotless home. It had to feel like a home for the children, too. Mrs. Daniels arrived early one morning, clipboard in hand, her face stern and unreadable. Elias greeted her at the door with a forced smile, masking the anxiety that bubbled beneath the surface. The moment she stepped inside, her eyes swept over everything: the carefully arranged living room, the spacious kitchen, the guest rooms that had now been transformed into real spaces for the children. But it wasn't just the house she was assessing. It was him. How did he live? What kind of father would he be? Could he provide for the children emotionally, not just financially? The first few hours felt like an endless interrogation. She asked about his daily routine, his work schedule, his emotional state. There were questions Elias hadn't anticipated, ones that dug into his personal life, questions about Emily, about his grief, and about his capacity for emotional connection. Each answer felt like a small piece of his soul being laid bare. "I see you're still wearing the scarf Emily gave you," Mrs. Daniels remarked, her tone softening slightly. "That's a nice memory, but how do you feel about creating new memories with the children?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't even realized he was still clinging to that scarf, to the past. But now it felt as if everything he was doing, every step he took to move forward, was a conscious choice to build a new life, to give Amelia and Luke the life they deserved. "I'm ready," Elias said, his voice steady. "I'm ready to make new memories. I don't want them to just survive. I want them to thrive." Mrs. Daniels gave a small nod, jotting something down on her notepad. But Elias could tell she wasn't convinced. The process would require more than just his words. It would take time, and more than that, it would require his actions to speak louder than anything he could say. As the days passed, Elias became more immersed in the adoption process. Social workers continued to come in and out, asking questions, reviewing paperwork, conducting interviews. But through all the scrutiny, Elias found himself growing closer to Amelia and Luke. In the beginning, he had been their protector, a safe place, a place of warmth and stability. But now, something was changing. They were no longer just children in his house. They were his children, his responsibility, his heart. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Amelia reached out to him, her small hand resting on his arm. "Mr. Morgan?" she said, her voice tentative. "Amelia, it's Elias," he corrected, though he said it with a smile. She nodded slowly, then spoke again, this time more confidently. "Elias, will you teach us how to cook? I want to make something for you. Something to say thank you." Her words made his heart swell. She had started calling him by his first name, a small but significant shift. It was a sign, Elias realized. She was beginning to see him not just as a guardian, but as a father. "I'd love that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "How about we start with something simple? Maybe a pasta dish?" Amelia grinned, and Luke, who had been listening intently, immediately perked up. "Can I help too?" he asked, his voice full of excitement. "Of course," Elias replied. "We'll make it together." It was moments like these, small, unspoken connections, that reminded Elias why he was fighting so hard for this family. Each day, he felt the bond between him and the children growing stronger. But just as quickly as that bond strengthened, so did his fear. Was he truly ready for this? Could he really be the father they needed? The emotional weight of the adoption process had begun to take its toll. Elias had spent so many years focusing on his career that he had forgotten how to connect with people on a deeper level. He had lived in a world where emotions were secondary to success, where the next deal or the next project took precedence over everything else. But now, his priorities were shifting, and with that shift came a new kind of fear, the fear of failing as a father. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Elias sat in his office, staring at the papers spread out before him. There were more evaluations to complete, more documents to sign, and the pressure was beginning to feel unbearable. He found himself questioning his ability to be the father they needed. What if he wasn't enough? What if he failed them the way he had failed Emily? But just as the doubt began to creep in, he heard a soft knock on his office door. Elias. Amelia's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Come in," he said, sitting up straighter, his heart immediately softening. Amelia stepped inside, clutching a drawing in her hand. "I made this for you," she said, walking over to his desk and handing it to him. Elias unfolded the paper, and his heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of their family, a stick figure version of the three of them, standing hand in hand with a large sun shining above them. Beneath the drawing, Amelia had written, "Family Forever." "I thought you'd like it," Amelia said, looking up at him with a shy smile. Elias felt his throat tighten, the emotion he had been holding back suddenly overwhelming him. He had spent so much time questioning whether he could provide for them, but in that moment he realized something important. It wasn't about the house, the money, or the adoption paperwork. It was about the love that had already taken root between them. The connection, the bond, it was real, and it was growing stronger every day. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Family forever." The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. The pressure from the adoption process was unrelenting, and Elias found himself constantly walking a tightrope between his professional responsibilities and his newfound family life. The balance was delicate, and he often found himself feeling torn between the two. But through it all, Amelia and Luke remained his anchor, the reminder of why he was fighting so hard. Each day, he spent time with them, listening to their stories, playing games, and teaching them things they had never learned before. He found himself enjoying the simple moments, helping Luke with his homework, baking cookies with Amelia, and reading bedtime stories to both of them. These moments were everything to Elias. They were proof that he wasn't failing them. They were proof that he could be the father they needed. But even as his bond with the children deepened, doubt still crept into his mind. There were times when he wondered if he was truly capable of being the father they deserved. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't the idealized father figure that some people might expect. But what he had, he gave freely: his time, his energy, and his love. Late one night, as Elias sat in the library reading with Amelia and Luke by his side, he looked at the two of them and realized something. This is what family feels like. There would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He had found something more precious than wealth or success. He had found love. And with that love, he was determined to fight for the family he had built. No matter the challenges, no matter the obstacles, he would never let go. It had been months of paperwork, evaluations, sleepless nights, and moments of doubt. But Elias stood in the middle of his office one morning, the weight of a long, emotional battle lifting from his chest, as the phone call he had been waiting for finally came through. The voice on the other end was clear, calm, and reassuring. "Mr. Morgan," the voice began, "I'm pleased to inform you that the adoption committee has approved your petition. Amelia and Luke are officially adopted. They are now legally your children." Elias stood frozen, the words taking a moment to sink in. His heart raced as a wave of emotions surged within him: relief, joy, and even disbelief. It had been such a long road, one fraught with challenges that had often made him question his ability to move forward. But now, standing at the end of that road, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. "Thank you," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. He swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "Thank you for everything." As the call ended, he stood there for a moment, his mind still processing the reality of what had just happened. He looked out the window, where the morning sun bathed the city in golden light, a sharp contrast to the stormy, uncertain days that had preceded it. The truth had come to light. He had fought for his name, for his company, and most importantly, for his new family. And now, Amelia and Luke were his, not just in his heart, but in every legal sense. They were his children, and nothing would change that. He let out a breath, releasing the tension he had been carrying for so long. Elias turned away from the window and walked into the living room, where Amelia and Luke were playing on the floor. Their laughter echoed through the house, a sound that had become Elias's lifeline. "Amelia, Luke," Elias called, his voice steady but filled with emotion. They both looked up, their eyes lighting up at the sight of him. "You two are official now," he said, his words tinged with wonder. "You're officially my children. We're a family, legally." Amelia's eyes grew wide, and she immediately jumped up from the floor, rushing to him. "Really?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. "Really," Elias said, kneeling down to her level. "It's official. You're mine, and I'm yours, forever." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, and she threw herself into his arms, clutching him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke, who had been more reserved, walked over slowly, his eyes searching Elias's face. "Does this mean we get to stay here forever?" he asked quietly. Elias smiled, his heart full as he pulled Luke into the hug. "Yes, buddy, you're home, for good." As Elias held them both, a quiet, bittersweet realization washed over him. In that moment, he understood what it truly meant to be a family. It wasn't about genetics, it wasn't about blood. It was about love, commitment, and the decision to choose each other. And in that decision, they had all found something they never expected: a sense of belonging, of purpose, and most importantly, a future. The days that followed were filled with preparations. Elias wanted to mark the occasion, to celebrate not just the legal adoption but everything it represented. It had been a long journey for him, for Amelia, and for Luke, and he knew that they deserved to start this new chapter with something special. The mansion, which had once felt cold and empty, was transformed for the occasion. Clara, the housekeeper, worked tirelessly alongside Elias to make sure everything was perfect. The grand dining room was decorated with flowers and candles, a large cake at the center of the table, its layers topped with a message that read, "A family united." The mansion was filled with the sounds of laughter and music, and for the first time in a long time, Elias felt a sense of joy that had been missing from his life. The celebration wasn't just for Elias and the children, it was for the community, the people who had supported him through the hardest moments. Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor who had always been kind, was there, her arms laden with homemade pies. Mr. Martinez, the retired teacher who had tutored Luke, brought his family to share in the joy. Even Sophie, the teenage girl who had been teaching Amelia to play the piano, arrived with a smile on her face. Amelia and Luke beamed with happiness as they greeted their friends and new family members. They had been through so much, yet now they were surrounded by warmth, by people who cared for them, and who were eager to be a part of their lives. The house, once a lonely place, now felt like a home. Elias stood at the center of the room, his heart swelling as he watched the children run around, laughing with their new friends. Luke was holding court, explaining the solar system to anyone who would listen, while Amelia showed off her latest drawing, a portrait of Elias, a picture of their family. "I still can't believe this is real," Elias muttered to Clara as she passed by with a tray of drinks. "You've earned it, Elias," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "You fought for them, and they fought for you too." Elias nodded, his eyes following Amelia as she spun in circles with Luke, their laughter filling the air. The weight of the past few months had been heavy, but in this moment, it all seemed worth it. He had found something he had been searching for his entire life: a family, a real family. Later that evening, as the last of the guests began to leave and the house quieted down, Elias stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The night sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above. It felt like the universe itself was celebrating this new chapter in his life. Amelia and Luke had already gone to bed, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Clara had retired to her quarters, and the mansion had once again become still. But Elias wasn't alone. The emptiness that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by a warmth he had never known. He thought about everything that had happened, the scandal, the legal battle, the pressure. It had all led him here, to this moment of peace, and he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance, a chance to be the man he had always hoped to be, not just for himself, but for the children who had walked into his life and changed everything. As he looked out over the city, he realized something profound. The true meaning of family wasn't about blood or legacy. It was about the people you choose to love, the people you choose to care for. And in that, Elias had found his purpose. Amelia and Luke weren't just the children he had taken in. They were his children. And this was their home. Together, they had created something beautiful. A family born from choice, born from love. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the journey but also the incredible gift that had come with it. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just the billionaire tech mogul or the man who had lost his way. He was a father, a protector. And nothing in the world could take that away from him. The days after the celebration felt like a dream. Life at the mansion had settled into a comfortable routine. Amelia and Luke were thriving. Amelia had started to take an interest in cooking, while Luke was immersing himself in his new books and astronomy projects. They were both becoming more confident, more comfortable in their new home. Elias continued to prove himself as the father they needed, guiding them with patience, love, and support. As he sat in the living room one evening, reading through the papers that would officially finalize the adoption, he looked up at the children who were curled up on the couch watching a movie. Their laughter, their presence, it was everything he had ever wanted. Elias smiled to himself as he signed the final adoption papers, his hand steady, the weight of the decision solid in his heart. They were his children, his family. And together, they would face whatever came next, with love as their foundation. Family forever, he thought to himself, the words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, Elias felt at peace, knowing that he had finally found his place in the world, not in the boardrooms of Morgan Tech, not in the cold, empty mansion, but here, with Amelia and Luke. Home. Elias stood in front of the grand windows of the mansion, gazing out at the city sprawled below. The skyline had always been a symbol of ambition, of what he had achieved through sheer willpower and relentless determination. But now, it seemed different. The steel and glass towers seemed a little softer, a little less imposing. The once cold, distant view now held a certain warmth, as if the world outside had finally come into focus. The mansion, once a place of solitude and shadows, had been transformed into a home, filled with life, with laughter, and most importantly, with love. Elias's life had completely transformed in a way he never could have predicted. He had gone from a billionaire CEO consumed by work to a man whose heart now beat for two children who had once been strangers. And while the challenges of his business were still there, his priorities had shifted. He was no longer defined by his wealth, his empire, or the accolades he had earned. He was defined by his role as a father, the greatest title he had ever received. The adoption process, with all its emotional highs and lows, had led them to this moment, the beginning of their future together. It was no longer just about Elias finding redemption. It was about him finding purpose in a way he had never imagined. And that purpose had come in the form of Amelia and Luke. With each passing day, Elias felt his connection with them deepen. He watched as Amelia's once shy demeanor blossomed into a confident, creative young girl. She had begun to take an interest in cooking, often pulling him into the kitchen to try out new recipes. Luke, with his boundless curiosity, spent hours poring over astronomy books, asking questions about the stars that Elias could barely keep up with. The mansion, which had once felt empty, now resonated with their energy, their presence. The house was full of life, full of noise, full of love. Elias's morning routine had changed too. Gone were the days when he rushed to the office before dawn, drowning in paperwork and corporate meetings. Now he woke up to the sound of laughter, to the smell of pancakes and freshly brewed coffee. He spent mornings helping Amelia with her art projects, or reading Luke's latest astronomy findings. He had learned to slow down, to savor the moments that once passed him by unnoticed. At night, they gathered around the dinner table, just as they had during the celebration. But it wasn't just the food that brought them together. It was the conversations, the shared moments of joy. They talked about their day, about their dreams, and sometimes about their pasts. Elias, for the first time in a long while, felt like he was living for something bigger than himself. He had always thought that success meant being at the top, that happiness could be bought. But now, he realized that true success, true happiness, was about the people you choose to share your life with. It was about building something that could withstand any storm, something that was more than just a place to sleep or eat. It was about creating a family, no matter how it came together. As the weeks passed, Elias found himself settling into a new routine, one that centered around the children. The house felt like a different place entirely. The empty rooms that had once felt like silent witnesses to his grief were now vibrant with color. Amelia's drawings filled the walls, and Luke's collection of space-themed books lined the shelves. Clara, his housekeeper, had even found herself laughing more, as the house had become more than just a job to her. It had become a home. She watched with pride as the children flourished in the environment Elias had worked so hard to create. Amelia, with her vibrant red hair and green eyes, had started to come out of her shell. She and Elias spent time in the garden, planting flowers and herbs, which was something Emily had always loved to do. Amelia had inherited that same passion for the outdoors, but now Elias was there to nurture it. He was there to guide her, to help her grow, just as Emily would have wanted. Luke, on the other hand, had become the resident scientist. He spent hours poring over his books, trying to understand the mysteries of the universe. He and Elias would often sit at the kitchen table, discussing planets, stars, and the wonders of space. Elias wasn't always able to answer all of Luke's questions, but he did his best, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. And the best part of it all? The fear was gone. At least, most of it was. Amelia and Luke had once feared that they would be sent back to the shelter, that their stability would crumble. But with every passing day, Elias's love for them only deepened, and so did their trust in him. They were no longer living in uncertainty. They were no longer waiting for the next storm to hit. They were safe. They were home. It wasn't just the children who had changed Elias's life. He too had grown. He had learned to let go of the past, to stop defining himself by his losses. When he looked at Amelia and Luke, he didn't see ghosts of the past. He saw hope. He saw a future that was his to build. The future, Elias knew, wasn't going to be without its challenges. There would be difficult days ahead. Raising 2 children wasn't easy, and his responsibilities as the CEO of Morgan Tech had not disappeared. But for the first time in years, Elias felt ready to face whatever came his way. With his family by his side, there was nothing he couldn't handle. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk in the study, Elias found himself looking at a photo that had been taken during their celebration. It was of the 3 of them, Elias, Amelia, and Luke, standing outside the mansion, the sun setting behind them, their smiles wide and genuine. It was the photo that marked the beginning of their new life together. Elias smiled at the picture, his heart swelling. They had come so far in such a short time, and yet it felt like they had always been together. He glanced at the clock and stood up, ready to pick up the children from their art class. As he walked toward the door, he looked back at the mansion, which now felt like a true reflection of his heart. Warm, inviting, and full of love. He had done it. They had done it. Together. The adoption papers had been signed. The legal battles were behind them. Amelia and Luke were no longer just children in his home. They were his children, officially, legally. And the world outside, with its challenges and uncertainties, didn't matter as much anymore. Elias had learned that the true meaning of family wasn't about bloodlines or ancestry. It was about the decision to choose each other, to make a commitment to love and care for each other, no matter what. Elias had chosen them, and in return, they had chosen him. That evening, as they sat around the table, their laughter echoing through the house, Elias realized that he had found what he had been searching for all along. It wasn't wealth, fame, or status that had given him peace. It was love. It was family. And in that moment, Elias knew that whatever the future held, he was ready. With Amelia and Luke by his side, he could face anything. Family forever, he thought, watching the two of them bicker playfully across the table. They had given him something priceless, something he had never expected to find, a sense of belonging, a place to call home. And for the first time in a long while, Elias felt at peace. The past was gone, and the future was bright, filled with the promise of new beginnings.